Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, first, let me say, Stabby is very upset she wasn't able to make this. She likes accents, so yours would have been right up her alley. Alas, time zones are a thing, and when you're from Ireland and she's from California, they just didn't mesh very well. So
that's fair.
Unfortunately, these things happen. So, Damien Larkin, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers at home?
Absolutely. Cheers. And first off, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. My name is Damien Larkin. If you haven't guessed from the accent, I'm Irish. So I live over here in Dublin, Ireland all my life. I served for 7 years in the Reserve Defence Forces in Ireland, primarily in the infantry. I was in a weapon support unit. So my bad boy, my baby of choice was a 60mm Vector mortar. Absolutely loved it. Fantastic weapon. I've been writing just over about 6.5 years now. I originally started off self-publishing. So I self-published my first book, I think, in about middle of 2018. And then I managed to get an indie trad deal. So I signed with a small press based over in North Carolina for my military science fiction series, the Big Red series, which is basically military science fiction with an Irish twist. And I've recently gotten back into self-publishing. So I self-published my novel Lizard Skin and Sharpened Steel a week ago, which is a military fiction. So it's dinosaurs and mercenaries with swords and shields. And I've recently found out that I've gotten into Spiffbo 10, which is the self-published fantasy blog off competition. So I'm one of 300 authors who are battling out to the death to claim that #1 spot. So it'll be a fun year ahead.
It helps when I unmute myself. So as an Irishman and someone who served in the Irish Army, have you seen the movie The Siege of Jadotville?
I have indeed. And to be honest, that's one of those, it's a very controversial film over here because
Really?
Everything you saw in there happened for real, but it was suppressed by the Irish military for years. Even when I was a child growing up, it wasn't a story that was told. The veterans who served there were humiliated to the point that they were considered cowards for surrendering, even though they fought on for 6 days, right down to the last bullet. The fact that none of them died, they killed something like, the numbers vary, but anywhere between 3 to 6 times their number. And keep in mind, it's 120 soldiers against battle-hardened mercenaries. They did a fantastic job defending what they needed to defend, following their orders to the last man, bringing honor to this country and to the UN, and they were effectively suppressed. They were whitewashed from history. And it's only in my generation, when we started hearing the stories of what these heroes did, that we started to get kind of public knowledge on the sacrifices they made. And I was absolutely moved to see that they're finally getting the recognition that they deserve. Sadly, some of them passed away before they were ever vindicated, but to us, they're absolute true life, real world heroes. They brought honor to this country, and we're absolutely delighted to see the honor that's finally been bestowed upon them.
It's a good movie. It's on Netflix if you have it. And so for numbers, just because I pulled up the wiki, it's 155 Irish soldiers and then 500 Irish, Indian, and Swedish soldiers under NATO banner, not in the main company that surrendered, that came to try to relieve them. And they were up against over 5,000 Kantangan mercenaries. They killed 300 of them, wounded another 1,000. And if you watch the movie, they break it down. And just as an infantryman myself, like last stands are kind of my thing. It's like, this is your element, basically, right? Like,
pretty much.
If you're American, and they not only did they fight to the last bullet, then they improvised their empty bullet casings and turned those into weapons for explosives. So like they proverbially they went down to their clawed hands and biting the ankles that you hear about in some of the ancient battles. Like that's essentially how gritty it got, and they still didn't lose anyone.
Remarkable people,
I don't understand how anybody would look at that and see that as anything other than like badass. Like when you know what really happened. I have trouble seeing how that could be viewed as anything but.
I think it was
I
the
have,
politicians more than anything. There was that kind of
yeah,
fear that because we were only recently getting into doing UN missions, which is a major part of Irish military honour is serving in the UN, because we were relatively new to that, the politicians thought, okay, if an Irish kind of company surrendered, it'll look bad on Ireland, so let's just whitewash it, let's just airbrush it from history and move on, which was a very shameful thing to do. But yeah, like I said, I'm glad they're vindicated. Absolutely.
so watching the movie and then reading about it in like, because it inspired me to see more. Because at first I was just, oh, this is a cool action movie, right? And
Yeah,
I'm like, oh crap, this really happened. So let's see what they got right, what they got wrong. Because history movies aren't always historical.
true.
They take the kernel of what happened and then sometimes they just make it up from there. That is not what happened in the movie. Like I said, I
Yeah,
really recommend, if you haven't seen it, people, you should go watch it on Netflix. Um,
absolutely do.
but
Fantastic.
I suspect it was more the politicians made mistakes and they didn't want to look bad, so it was covering their own butts more than it
Yeah,
was worried about anything else, which is a story as old as time as well, right?
exactly, exactly. Regardless of country, you do tend to see it. It's one of those things that stayed with us as part of the national conscious, and we're glad to see that the true story is now being told. And they did bring us honor at the end of the day. Did a fantastic job with what little support they had. So I mean, fair play to each and every one of them.
Yeah, I just assumed, I didn't realize it was that much of a thing. I would have just assumed like we know about the Alamo, you guys would have known
Yeah.
about that just because it's, like I said, it's badass. But
Yeah, again, yeah, it's only within, let's say, my generation. I distinctly remember picking up the book that film was based on when I was on a training exercise in one of Ireland's kind of premier kind of army bases called the Glen of Amal. We
uh-huh.
were allowed to go into town one of the days, just for a couple of hours to ourselves, and I went into a bookshop and picked that up just randomly because they had an entire section dedicated to military history, and I just randomly picked up that book and said, "Oh, I've never heard about any of this. This is so surreal." Like, you think like an entire battle, that the Irish armies fought in would be a thing that I would have learned, being within that institution. And I read up on it, and I was absolutely gobsmacked to see some of it. And I remember I worked in a pub at the time. I worked in a pub for about 10 years. So when I wasn't kind of doing the soldier thing, I was kind of working full time. But I brought it into an old Irish army veteran who was a regular who came in there. I showed him, and he started flicking through some of the pictures, and he recognized some of the people there because he'd served in the Congo the year before. So he kind of recognized some of the faces of the NCOs who weren't necessarily in that particular kind of battle, but who were kind of over within the same kind of general area at the same time, which really, really brought it home for me.
Yeah, it was amazing. This is one of those situations where sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. Like, I distinctly remember there are things that I wrote in my first novel series,
Yep.
was with a British publisher, actually. And I remember I wrote something that actually happened to me, and he's like, JR, you got to take this out. Nobody's going to believe you.
No way.
This is not believable. And he didn't know. I'm like, what are you talking about? That happened to me.
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't care. Like, the people will think this is unbelievable. And when I watched that movie, I'm like, if I wrote that in a mill sci-fi novel, people would be like, oh yeah, right. That wouldn't
Yeah.
really happen. And you're reading about it like, well, it actually did right here.
Yeah. Which is
It's one of
surreal,
the,
isn't it?
it's so surreal. It's like if we tried to write that in a novel, people would be like, okay, sure, you know, like it's you'll get the eye roll you would if you wrote Thermopylae in space,
Yeah,
right?
he's
Like, it's
making
like,
it up.
of course they had the perfect
Yeah,
terrain and
I know.
whatever, but those things
Yeah,
are inspired by
exactly.
the real events, and like what are you talking about? These were these men.
Yeah.
So it's kind of fascinating for me. I didn't realize that was only recently talked about. That's crazy.
Yeah, yeah, big time. Yeah,
Well,
let's say the last
let me
15
be the
years.
first to say on this podcast that I think they were all badass heroes. So you've
Thank you
heard it
very
from
much.
me
And look,
first.
100% fair play to you.
All right. So the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we found them. So we actually, a friend of the show, Steve, is a fan
Real
of your
Steve.
work, and he's constantly sending me authors I've never heard of who write books that I should read. And so I'm like, oh, let's do this interview. So I'm glad it worked out. I'm glad we could make the time zones happen. There was a hit or
Absolutely.
miss a couple times because, like I said, time zones are the bane of our
Time zones.
existence on podcast.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
before we dive
And
in, though, sir,
yeah,
we have to ask you the religion question. Are you ready for
okay.
this?
I
All
am
right.
ready. Bring it on. Bring it on.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Star Trek.
Okay,
Absolutely
why?
Star Trek, hands down. Like it's just one of those kind of programs where I mean, as you know, someone who writes military science fiction, I'm used to kind of writing about the negative. I'm used to writing about kind of like real world stuff, I suppose, to a certain degree. Where, if you look at the Robert Heinlein kind of view of, you know, violence being the only way to kind of solve a problem, that is what I'd consider real world. You know, I don't think we're in a situation where we can sit down and have serious negotiations with our enemies all the time. You know, it's one of those things where I think Star Trek has its head in the future where it imagines this different world where, you know, people get along, where it's not about conquest or domination. It's about kind of, you know, working through your differences and establishing like an almost kind of perfect kind of paradise, you know, where everybody can be different, everyone can be kind of equal, everyone can be happy. You can work a job, but you're not bound to it. It's not about kind of like money, you know. It's about kind of like you fulfilling the best part of yourself to contribute to the wider part of society, you know, pursuing your kind of your dreams and your happiness and stuff. So for me, it's always going to be the next generation, just in terms of seeing everything kind of so fresh faced. You know, you're getting out there, exploring this wider world. I can think Captain Jean-Luc Picard is by far one of the most fascinating characters in kind of science fiction I've ever met. You know, someone who's refined, intelligent, not afraid to kind of resort to force, but it's always the last course of action. He's constantly thinking outside the box on how to achieve his goals. You know, he's willing to use diplomacy. It's just as a series, it inspires me to kind of think that maybe if humanity gets its shit together, we can, you know, we could make that something like that happen here. You know, it's not something I think would happen in the next decade, 100 years. It might even take, you know, centuries for it to happen. But I think if something happens, you know, in Star Trek it was World War III, but if we had something like that that kind of, you know, give humanity a chance to breathe and say, we can't do this anymore. We can't survive another round of this. We have to do better. You know, can we do it? You know, so to me, it's just the positive reinforcement of Star Trek. I absolutely love it.
So for me, for me, Star Trek is a little bit too utopian. Like I
Yeah,
think if you take like, oh, we don't have money, like I don't understand. Like that motivates people to work. Like
yeah,
if you have a post scarcity society, I don't know that you'll have people achieving dreams because, you know, they're just going to sit around and do whatever because why not? Right? Like
yeah,
I
and
don't know.
it's
I don't know
fair.
that
Like,
that works for me. Um, but I will say I do. I mean, I've enjoyed the stories. I've enjoyed the movies. I've watched The Next Generation. There were some episodes I
yeah,
didn't really like. Q was a little bit
no,
too much
yeah,
God in the Machine for me.
yeah.
But I liked Captain Ben Cisco. I
Oh,
can't remember which
fantastic.
one he was on.
Yeah,
He
Deep Space
was,
Nine.
yeah, Deep Space Nine, because I mean, growing up in the 90s, a lot of times when you would see men and dads, they were always the buffoons that needed to be saved by their wives and their kids.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
to see like a heroic man doing manly things who was also a good family man, like I just liked
yeah.
that. It was
It was.
against type, I guess. So I
Yeah.
really like that character. Um I don't
Really,
know,
really
just
did it off, and he's a fantastic actor as well. And just in
yeah,
how he portrayed it, like I distinctly remember there was a couple of different episodes where he stepped outside the box. Where I think there was one in particular where he had to take on the or Jadzia Dax. She was the Trill, so she had
yeah.
like the lifetime memories of like 7 or 8 different people in. You know, she carried with her inside her symbiont. But part of her kind of culture's rituals was that I think it was once every couple of years that the personalities had to be separated out. So you'd have like one of the lifetimes went into someone else's body, another went into, you know, someone else's, and part of the kind of ceremony was that she had to invite her close friends to kind of take on the personalities of one of those kind of past lives. But someone who inhabited her beforehand was a murderer who'd kind of killed like 2 people. So Cisco took on that character, and he did it from the safety of a cell. So there was an energy shield all up. But like as soon as the kind of entity enters into him, you just see it's almost like he kind of blinks, and his entire demeanor changes, and even how he speaks. It's like in real life and in the Cisco character, it's such a deep kind of like masculine kind of powerful voice, but it changes into this refined, almost high pitched effeminate voice, you know, to kind of portray the chilling aspects of the character. And it was just mind blowing experience. It was just positively like, wow, that's just acting next level right there, you know?
Yeah, and you tend not to expect that. Like you expect TV sci-fi to be kind of campy.
Yeah.
And so the fact that he played it straight as an actor, I really liked. Like he
Oh,
was
oh yeah. Absolutely. I
that
think
was some top tier acting. That actor. I don't know if he did anything
okay.
else after Deep Space Nine, but it was good
Yeah, I
acting.
don't think I heard like I know we did American History X, and I think that was in between the series of Deep Space Nine. But afterwards, I heard he just retired from acting. I think he's teaching music at some college somewhere. Was the last I heard. He's notoriously, I think he has a notorious kind of private life. He likes to keep to himself type of thing. But just to see the range of his acting abilities and how he kind of portrayed that character, and I think a lot of that as well ties in with Ronald D. Moore, who was like I think he was the showrunner for the next generation in the last couple of seasons, but he also relaunched the rebooted Battlestar Galactica, and he brought an element of darkness to Deep Space Nine with the whole Dominion War kind of arc,
Yeah,
which was absolutely that's military science fiction at its finest. And the way they slowly build up to there's this new power called the Dominion, and you're hearing the name dropped, and then you have the first interaction with them. The Federation gets their asses kicked, and then the Romulans and the Cardassians go in after them, and then I'm not going to spoil it for anyone who hasn't watched it, but my God, absolutely powerful storytelling.
yeah, and given the garbage that's coming out of modern TV and movies, like I've been going backwards to watch stuff I missed too.
Absolutely.
So it's one of those things where I've seen bits and pieces, but I haven't seen whole things.
Yeah.
So now that
I
I've got
highly
the
recommend it.
Netflix,
Yeah,
it's on my
do.
list. So
It's
right,
absolutely fantastic.
because we are polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia.
Game of Thrones, hands down, and that's just because I've read all the books. I absolutely adored it. It was absolutely fantastic kind of series. I'd never kind of read anything like that. I openly admit that I'm more of a science fiction fan than I am when it comes to fantasy. So growing up, it was probably 90% of my read was science fiction, and the other 10% was fantasy. So when I kind of came across the Game of Thrones book, one of my friends, he was a huge fan of the series. He recommended it to me. I think it was the year that the first season came out, and I was like, yeah, okay, go on, I'll check it out. And from within the first couple of pages, I was hooked. And I literally just religiously went up and just bought every single book I could. I followed along with the series, really enjoyed it, really enjoyed the spin off, The House of the Dragon. I know there was a lot of kind of negative coverage over the last season of Game of Thrones, which look I completely understand to a certain degree. But there's still fantastic moments in that show, in the TV show. And as for the book series, everyone is just dying for the Winds of Winter. I just want to see what he's been working on for all these years. I want to read George R. Martin's words, find out what he had kind of in mind, because again, keep in mind that the TV series kind of limits the amount of kind of arcs and points of view that are from the book series. So I can't wait for it to come out, and I hope it comes out.
Yeah, I do wonder if he painted himself into a corner, and you might have to get Brandon Sanderson to finish it for him.
I think so. I think the fan reaction to the last season, I think, from what I heard is like he sat down with the showrunners and explained to them, right, here's where I'm going with this. And they were like, okay, that's grand. They took the idea, developed it into TV, but the writers for the last season kind of dropped the ball in the execution. So, they kind of maybe if, say, for example, George R. R. Martin did plan for Daenerys Stormborn to go crazy and just kind of burn down the place and stuff. And apologies for there's spoilers there, but if you haven't seen it already, come on, people. But yeah, when she kind of the way she kind of changes is just so dramatic. Whereas I think if it had been in book version, you would have slowly kind of saw the darkness within her rise, because you had moments where she was kind of crossing the line, but at the same time you were like, it's Daenerys Stormborn, the breaker of chains, mother of dragons. Of course she has to be fierce, but I think in the TV series it was just too abrupt, and I think that's what threw people off a little bit. Where it's like you went to all this effort to do this one thing and then just lose it at the last minute. I just find it hard to believe. I think it was lazy writing from the individual writers versus what the overall story was supposed to be.
I like some of the reviews of it though, because they break it down from like a tactical perspective. There's a podcast that's called The Angry Staff Officers, and I don't know if that's a trope in the Irish Army, but a lot of officers that were combat arms, when they get stuck on staff duty when they hit major, so it's between company command and battalion command, they do a stint on staff. Most of them are perpetually angry because they don't want to be in an office. They want to be out in the field doing whatever. And so they broke it down a lot. They do a lot of movies, but stuff like they broke down from the logistics why it was a badly planned out battle, what they got wrong on the strategies, why this didn't work. Because if this is the size of your castle, you would need X number of roads and X pounds of food to feed X number. And they just broke it down, and it was so fun to listen to. It was like really cool. History nerd meets sci-fi. So if you haven't checked out their podcast, I recommend it, dear listeners, called The Angry Staff Officer. And they also do tidbits of war history. So like they did a podcast about the White Death, which was a Finnish sniper who was taking on the advancing Russian forces during World War II when they were advancing into Finland. And like he's one of the most prolific snipers in world history. Now, as a historian, I look at it like he became such a like the boogeyman that I wonder if some of the ones that the Russians attributed to him weren't just like guy tripped and fell and broke his neck and it must have been the White Death kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And they called him the White Death because it was in an Arctic climate and like he's burying himself in snow to take these shots. So he blends in. But they cover like forgotten pieces of history that are just so cool in global military history to just like break into. So if you're a history nerd at all, that podcast is top tier.
Yeah, I'll check that. That sounds fantastic. Yeah, I'd love to learn more about
that. But they broke down a lot of the battles in Game of Thrones. They also did like Rogue One, why that was a poorly planned mission, destined to fail from the beginning. so and it's all from the logistics. They're like, they didn't factor in this, they got this wrong, and it's just. And it's not saying it's bad storytelling. It's just bad officership. Like, of course the officers messed up. They didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, I'll blame the officers. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, incompetent officers happen. So, like, to say, like, see, that's the danger in fiction is because you can, is to make everything too perfect.
Yeah.
And so I'm willing to, as long as it's thought out, to give them room for, like, of course, the guy just messed up. He was a bad officer, and of course that can happen, right? And they just break it down from the logistics side, and it's glorious. So
brilliant. Yeah, no, I'll check that out. That's
all right. And so one of the great shames of adulthood is they stop asking us what our favorite dinosaur is. So I'm going to ask you, sir, what is your favorite dinosaur?
Tyrannosaurus Rex, like hands down. I know that's probably the most common answer out there, or one of them. It's just something about it. It's just like I remember reading about it like as a child because I love kind of reading dinosaur books and just thinking this sounds like unreal to try and imagine that something like that once stalked this planet for like millions of years. And I think like again, many people of my generation would remember kind of the first Jurassic Park film coming out and just being absolutely astounded by the presence of the Tyrannosaurus. Like I think like I still to this day can remember that scene where they're kind of sitting in the car and it's raining and you just hear this distant kind of like boom and you kind of see the water shake and everyone's kind of like, what the fuck is going on? Like, and they look out and you see the Tyrannosaurus kind of appear, the leg stomping down into the mud. It's just one of those iconic scenes of kind of film history. And I think they did fantastic justice in showing that as a creature, which is just the stuff of absolute nightmare. So yeah, T-Rex all the way.
It holds up too. So one of the things that's changed since that movie came out, and since Michael Crichton wrote the books, if you haven't read the books by Michael Crichton, I recommend.
Very good, yeah.
They're very good. And the books were so good. I'm kind of upset that the franchise was good, and on its own, I like it. If you haven't read the books, you can watch the franchise. Even the kids show Camp Cretaceous is good. All 4 seasons of that, but there was so much that was left out about how they started migrating, the dinosaurs did, into human controlled areas that it was only barely touched on the last episode of the kids cartoon. Right. And I'm like, there's so much room for story there. And you just left it like, on the cutting room floor. It's one of those things where it's like, I mean, I get it. And it still holds up to this day. I can watch the original and it's like, it works. But since that came out, they actually now suspect that a lot of the dinosaurs would have been feathered.
I heard that,
like lizard scaled. I don't know that we really know. I mean, we're all kind of guessing.
I think it's Terry more than Anton, But can you imagine that wouldn't look terrifying at all? Like there's something about like a giant chicken basically, coming at you. Yeah. You're like, no, it'll be grand here. Just throw some seeds at it. Whereas if it's scaly, it gives that kind of thing about the reptiles where like most humans are instinctively kind of terrified of reptiles because going back to our mammalian kind of where we kind of evolved from, like the reptiles are one of the biggest threats. So I think there's something subconscious there, seeing the scaly skin on something like that just puts the fear inside you,
It goes back to the fear of like snakes and crocodiles and
exactly
the apex unfeeling predator. So I really dig it. But the other cool thing that's come out is they've since found a couple of the throat regions more intact than others of a Tyrannosaurus Rex and some of the other dinosaurs. And so they had an AI, they got an AI program to figure out like if we rush air through it based on what we know, and they could recreate as accurately as we can guess what they sounded like.
No way.
And it almost
That's
sounds like
amazing.
a laughing clown more than like a roar. And somehow it's even more like freaky.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it was like I almost rather it would just roar at me because I
Yeah.
listen and listen. I'm like, ooh, if I can find like the audio clip that's on YouTube somewhere, if I can find it, I'll throw it in the show notes, dear listener.
Please. I'd
And
love to hear that. Just
it
just
is,
out of curiosity.
I'll send it to you too, but it is worth listening to.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. I look forward to that.
All right, I'm making a note of that to come back to that. All right, so but yeah, dinosaurs are a win. I'm glad you like the show. Have you seen Primeval?
I haven't, I've heard about it. It's not something I've checked out. Again, it's just like it's only on my radar. One of my colleagues over on Instagram started writing for the franchise, and I knew nothing about it. I just happened to Wikipedia it, and I was like, "Wow, well, I've never even heard the show." So I'll have to kind of see if I can find it on YouTube or something.
Yeah, I watched it on Netflix or Prime. I can't remember, but it's out
Okay.
there on the streaming platforms. And the basic premise is all of the xeno creatures that people think of, like the Yeti, the Sasquatch, which I
Yep.
know same thing, Loch Ness monster. I understand there's an Irish version of Loch Ness monster that you guys kind of have your own version of it.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, we have kind of like ghost stories and stuff like the Banshee and all that. Like, but not like no, I'm not aware of a monster floating around.
I have never done the deep dive, so I don't know. I just you see stuff on the internet. You never know what's
Yeah.
true and what's
Yeah.
right. Although there's a couple books on Irish mythology that I've ordered for another gamelit project I'm working on that I'll dive in. But either way, the premise of Primeval is that there's time anomalies, and these are actually ancient creatures coming through time portals, and we're just seeing them because of that, and that
Right.
explains like all these monster sightings.
That's awesome.
And they even tie in some of like the Native American creatures.
Yeah.
And there's one episode that I thought was pretty cool. It's like Hunt for the Red October meets Jurassic Park, because this British submarine goes through this time anomaly and it ends up fighting with nuclear warheads, like this giant prehistoric whale that wants to eat
That's
it.
amazing.
It's
Oh, that
awesome.
sounds so cool.
And so the series, and then there's called Primeval New World, which is Primeval is set in the UK.
Yeah.
Primeval New World is set in Canada. Both of them are worth watching. They're both in the same world, but they're not like just a reshot of the
Yeah.
same series. And it's so amazing, and it's just like all the awesome dinosaur stuff. I rewatched that series because they only got a couple seasons each. I rewatch it every couple of years just because it's so cool.
I will definitely check that out. Yeah, I'll certainly add that to the list. Did you ever see Terra Nova?
I did. It was one of those crying shames. It was on
I
Fox
couldn't believe it.
Entertainment, where
Yeah.
all good shows go to die.
Yeah.
I'm still bitter that they ended it because it ended on such a cliffhanger. But
It
the whole
really did. It
premise,
was a fantastic series. It really
it
was. It blew my
was.
mind. So
I
cool.
loved
Just
it.
couldn't
It's
believe it.
called Terra Nova, dear listener, and basically Earth is dying, so they go to the Earth's past, and they have to survive to build a society there and not destroy it this time. And they have this really badass like spec ops guy that goes through first to establish the link and hold it open, and he has to survive in dinosaur world with just a knife and a pistol for like the first 3 days before they can start sending supplies. And just like I'm like, that alone is a story worth telling,
Yeah.
like in its own right. Like I'd read that series.
Hands down.
So
Hands down. Yeah.
yeah, it's a shame. I wish that there were books in that franchise because it's too good and it's
But
just
there's
abandoned.
so much potential. Yeah, absolutely. You could take it in any direction and still come up with a fantastic story. So you never know. Maybe they'll kind of relaunch it, or they'll open it up for franchising.
Or
That
the idea of Earth is dying, so we go back in time, like that isn't trademarkable. So you could, as long as you took the premise and you didn't take anything else from them, like you could tell your own story in that universe. And if you write it, send us an email. We want to interview and I want to read it.
that is a deal and a half.
Right? Because I mean, we'll have you on. We'll talk to them with you. Because the danger of something like that is you could fall down a rabbit hole of research because you'd be looking at all of the flora and the fauna and the creatures and the bugs.
Yeah.
And I'd read it to them. I really would.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can ever execute it, I'll let you know. You'll be the first to know, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things in the Primeval world is these guys get Jumanji'd almost. You familiar with that
Oh,
franchise?
Yes,
Only they
yes,
get
I do.
in Primeval, and like you got mosquitoes that are the size of your head, and like
Yeah,
and they're surviving in prehistoric whatever. Not sure if they're going to be able to get an anomaly to get home,
right.
and it's just like ultimate survivor right there.
Oh, that sounds really cool. Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can find it somewhere because that sounds right up my alley.
See,
Definitely.
now I'm going to have to do an episode where we do panel episodes too, where we just talk about various franchises, and
Yeah,
now that's going to have to go on my list because it's just too awesome.
yeah,
All
definitely.
right, we've got one more religion question for you. Are you
Bring it
ready
on.
for the last one?
I am ready. Bring it on.
All right, because we are civilized human beings, we are no longer knuckle dragging troglodytes. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Coffee, 100%. I am coffee fueled. I wouldn't exist without my morning cup of coffee. And I know for a fact, because I had a cup, or had to go a day last week without having, Anthony had to go in for a medical test, no coffee allowed, and I nearly fell apart, like just from the inside out. So I take my coffee. I have one cup of coffee a day. It used to be 7 or 8, but I've reduced because I needed it when I was younger, with all the work and running around and stuff. But I have my morning cup of coffee, and I'm very religious about this. It has to be strong. It has to have a drop of milk, no sugar, like stirred. And then I sit down and I read my morning news. Every single morning without fail. That's what I do, and that's what I do to center myself. And I can, I suppose I could just about exist without it. Like I can, on that one day when I had to go without coffee, I was still helping my children get ready for school, still helping them, get their lunches together, getting everything together, everything they needed. But a part of me on the inside was dying because I didn't have my caffeine fix. Just, it was like the atoms were dissipating. It was like that, bit of end game, or, when everyone kind of filters away and turns to dust. That's
Yeah.
how I felt for that entire day. And it was the longest I've ever been without coffee that I can think in living memory. As soon as I got back from the hospital, it was about 4:30 in the day. I had my coffee, and within about 5 minutes, I was a human being again. So yes, coffee.
Absolutely. So I will say the best cup of coffee I've ever had was the Green Bean. It's a company that worked for AFES,
Nice.
which is the Army Air Force Exchange Services
Yeah.
in the U.S. It is a franchise much like a Starbucks, but it's
Right.
it's on all the forward deployed Army bases.
Yeah.
It was some of the best coffee I've ever had. Now, I have talked to people who had deployed when I did to Iraq in the early war, who
Yeah.
have gone to there's a couple places in the US on military bases that have a green bean, and they've
Yeah.
said they've gone back afterwards and the coffee tasted like garbage. So I don't know if it was better then, if it just went down in quality. I don't know if just having almost died made it taste better.
Right.
But I still distinctly remember coming back from patrol and
Yeah.
going in line and waiting for an hour of my very limited free time to get a
Yeah.
green bean coffee, and it was the best coffee I had ever had. And if I could have married it,
Amazing.
I would have. It was like earth-shattering, soul-moving goodness. And then the other one is I still get shudders thinking about it. So we get instant Folgers coffee in our MREs. Do
Right. Oh yeah.
your field MREs? I'm sure you have an equivalent. Do they have coffee in them?
Oh yeah. Absolutely. It's the one thing that keeps us
Um,
going.
yeah, so we have the instant Folgers, and so we would be so exhausted because of the way we were run to the ground. We would do
Yeah.
10 hours on the road, then 4 hours on a base, then 10 hours on the road, and that was it. And if you're an
Yeah.
NCO, that meant 10 hours on the road, 2 hours post and an hour post mission stuff, including briefings, then 2 hours of sleep, then an hour of pre-mission briefings, then 10 hours on the road. So we were perpetually exhausted
Yeah.
because
Absolutely.
you're the first up and the last to go to sleep as an NCO.
Yeah.
Especially when you've got all those briefings. And so we would stick the instant Folgers coffee under our lips like dip, so the caffeine would go straight to our bloodstream.
Seeping into you.
Yeah, and so now I look at instant coffee and I still get the ick. Like I just can't. I'm like, nope,
Yeah.
nope, can't do it. I gotta brew it fresh.
That's amazing.
But yeah, there's a reason war is a young man's game. I'm just saying.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
I
fair.
was
That's
20
fair.
and exhausted. I couldn't imagine doing that at 40.
Oh yeah, no, definitely not. But yeah, that's a tip. I've never heard of the caffeine thing under the tongue.
A
I'll keep
lot
that in
of us
mind.
were doing it. A lot of
Yeah.
us were doing it. And so I do wonder if wars might be won quicker if you send the 40-year-old grumpy dudes. Like, look,
Yeah,
I've got an
clearly.
hour. I need to take my nap and my Geritol. Let's do this thing. We're going to fight this battle. And then the mess hall.
Yeah, just send me there without coffee. First thing in the morning. Give me an hour or two.
Exactly.
See what happens.
I think John Scalzi wrote The Old Man's War, which is basically
Yes,
that premise.
it is a
I haven't
fantastic
read
story.
it, but it is on my list because, I mean, like, War would look a lot different if it was only done by 40-year-old grumpy dudes who haven't had their morning coffee, right?
Yeah, exactly. I have to say, now I've only read 3 books in that series, but it is fantastic. It's really, really enjoyable. Even the premise around it, like Earth, in perpetual war, trying to seize planets, it's kind of painted that we're not necessarily the good guys in that. We're not going to roll over either, type of stuff. And old people, like once you hit a certain age, say it's 75, you get like your conscience is downloaded into this like fancy, super, ultra, like strong body and stuff with a kind of program in your brain. It's just that's next level. It's next level military science fiction.
Yeah. So before I forget, since you mentioned you had kids, I will say that if your kids are over 10, Primeval is not inappropriate. It is appropriate for 10 and up, I would say. I mean,
Perfect.
there's a little bit of like Jurassic Park level of violence because dinosaurs eat things, but it's not like gratuitous, graphically violent because, I mean, it was TV in the early aughts. So I would say if their kids are over 10, it's appropriate for the dinosaur lovers amongst us.
I'd like to think that I could get them to sign on, but to be honest, they have none of it. I tried to get them to watch Jurassic Park with me last week because it was book launch. It's a book about dinosaurs and stuff like that, and I was like, "Come on, let's watch dinosaurs." And like, "No, Dad, we're sick and tired of Jurassic Park because you made us watch it so many times." I asked you to watch it like once, like a year ago. That was it. That was like the first time. And like, "Dad, we don't like dinosaurs." Like, and I was like, "All right."
So you failed at parenting. You need to go back to the drawing board and try again.
Yeah.
Clearly, they need to replace those children with better ones.
Clearly, where did I go wrong?
Wait a minute, are these the milkmans? Because I would have kids that like dinosaurs. The young kids are like, "What's a milkman? What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
I remember distinctly getting milk delivered to the house in the 80s.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
So obviously, like you liked Star Trek. You mentioned liking that as a young man.
Yep.
How did you discover the world of like speculative fiction, so sci-fi, fantasy, all the things? Like, how did you come into becoming a fan? Because before you were a creator of content, you were a consumer, I would assume.
Absolutely, yeah. I think my first real kind of just being wowed by a book was Ender's Game. I distinctly remember reading that. I think was about 12. I got it from my local library. So I used to live down in the library every weekend. My mother would take me down there. We'd grab a couple of books, and I'd be happy out for the next couple of weeks. I just happened across this copy called Ender's Game. Read the back of it. Was like a child kind of soldier. I was like, okay, that sounds okay. Big chunky kind of book. There's like a hefty amount of word count in it, and I just read it cover to cover within the space of about 2.5 days and was just like mind blown. Like I'd never read anything like what I just inhaled into my brain after reading that story. Like from the plot twists, the premise, the world building, the action, like that massive twist at the end. It just absolutely, that's what did it for me right there. And I think from that day on, I just kept trying to find more and more kind of different bits and pieces of science fiction. And I'm a bit of a history kind of nerd as well, so anything to do with World War One or World War Two. But on the sci-fi front, definitely Ender's Game, fantastic book.
So I think he was one of the first guys to do like futuristic sports. Him and Orson Scott Card and Heinlein both created new sports, basically taking into account like zero G and technology and stuff. I liked it.
The whole 3D aspect of a battlefield, it's just something that, at that age, I was just like, wow, I couldn't even imagine that, because before I kind of enlisted in the infantry, like my thoughts of a battle were like what I'd kind of seen in kind of movies where the bad guys are over there, we're over here. They just kind of shoot at each other until enough of the bad guys die, and then you walk over there and you take it, which I know that's, it's clearly not the case at all, but like for a 12-year-old who, that was my concept of what a war was, all of a sudden have this 3-dimensional battlefield kind of open up, that there's no up, there's no down, there's no left, there's no right, and kind of using the different aspects of the game to kind of I suppose overcome your enemy. So even the likes of kind of the way they shot themselves to freeze them into position and use that against the enemy, I was like, this is just revolutionary. I never thought of anything like that, which is just crazy good.
So when did you decide, okay, I like consuming these books? And what was your first fantasy, by the way?
It was a military fantasy. It was called Children of the Dying, and it was utterly terrible. That's why you won't find it on Amazon. It was one of those things where I'd wanted to write for a very long time. I suppose that the short version of the story is I was working part time at the time. I was looking after my two children full time while my wife, she's the careerist, I'm the dreamer. So she wanted to kind of go back into her career after our two children, which that was fine with me. I had an app development business on the side, so I was developing apps a little bit. Ended up with getting 3 contracts with an American company, an influencer, and another personality over in America, and released these emoji apps, and they just exploded, like in the worst possible way. Like they were designed fine, didn't get any sales. Might as well have taken a big pile of cash and just set it on fire. So I had one of those kind of dark, what did they call it, the dark night of the soul, where you sit there
Right.
and think like, what the fuck am I doing with my life? Like seriously, like do we pour more gasoline on this fire and hope it works out, or do I need to kind of pivot? And as I kind of sat there, I mapped out where my life wanted to be. So, for example, in a year, I wanted my app development business to be self-sufficient. In year 2, I wanted to be able to hire people to automate it a little bit more. Year 3, I wanted to be able to kind of earn a profit that I could quit my part-time job. Year 4, year 5, blah blah blah. Basically, at the end of all that was, I think, about year 5, it was like I'm going to have enough income from this side kind of project, this gig. It's going to be my full-time occupation. I'm going to be, earning enough that I can dedicate my time to writing. And it was like that lightning bolt moment when it was like, why am I putting myself through all this stress, doing something that I don't enjoy doing, clearly not making any money for it, investing all these hours just to get to a point where I can say, hey, I'm going to sit down and start writing a book. And like that, it was just like the light bulb moment. Got rid of the 3 contracts, wound down my business, started writing the next day, and within about 3 months, I had 100,000 words written, which I was shocked at that, like that level. Obviously, it was only first draft. I kind of refined it, edited it, went through multiple drafts, published it, and it flopped. It bombed. And looking back now, I understand it was due to not having the experience. I didn't really understand the ins and outs of writing or marketing or cover design or anything like that. But that in itself was a lesson, and it's not something that I ever regret doing. I think I needed to put it out there to prove to myself that I could actually do it. And from that, that's where I kind of, once that kind of fell apart, I moved on to Big Red, my military science fiction series, and I haven't looked back since. So yeah, it's been a fun journey,
Okay.
roller coaster.
Absolutely. So given that your experience with the writing, do you
Yep,
think your time in uniform as a soldier in the Irish Republic Army, is that right?
it's just the Irish Army. So
Okay.
we call it the Defence Forces.
Okay. So how did your time in the defense forces affect the way you tell stories?
Oh, I say powerfully. Like when I enlisted, I was 16, so I lied about my age to get in, which was the norm. I say that to some people, and they're like, "You did what? What?" But again, my generation. I don't want to keep saying my generation. I know it makes me sound super old. It was only like 22 years ago, but that's what we did back then. We lied about our age to get in, because we wanted to serve, and especially in the reserves. The whole point of it was that a lot of us had kind of, you could have been in college, you could have had a full time job, you could have just been, wanting to do something different. You wanted to give back to the country that we loved. And that's what I wanted to do. And I enlisted, and it was a powerful experience. I rate it as one of the best things I've ever done in my entire life. The Defence Forces taught me a lot. They taught me about kind of confidence in myself, confidence in other people, teamwork, communication skills. They taught me patience. They taught me discipline. They taught me how to power through really boring, repetitive emotions, and different things like that. On top of all the fun stuff like section and attack and company and attack and stripping and assembling weapons and all that fun stuff. But I think was the ability to kind of communicate what you're trying to say in as few words as possible, essentially. And we would have had kind of drills where yeah, it's like real life field simulations where it's kind of, they're obviously blanks and stuff like that, but you've got like explosions going off, you've got the fucking bullets, machine guns, LMGs, flares, everything, kind of detonating all around you. You have to, as a section, we are tasked with taking a specific area. We have to be able to communicate with each other. We have to understand each other. We have to fulfill our objective, no matter what. So I think it's little lessons like that, like how to say something without using as many words as possible, for example, would be something that I could say directly influenced how I do it. I don't believe in going into very big, long, descriptive kind of scenes. I think there's a time and a place for it, and there's nothing wrong with it if it complements the overall scene. But I try and keep it short and sharp. And I think some people have described some of the battle scenes in my kind of, or even like my overall kind of novels as kind of like the fire from an LMG or an FSG, where it's 3 second bursts. We have these 3 second bursts of violence, chaos, madness, things falling apart. Then like a momentary silence, respite, where the story progresses a bit more, and then 3 second burst again. So it's I took all that different stuff. I took the practical experience of being like an infantry soldier, and added it into my military science fiction series. Like I don't write about kind of heroes. They're not all bare chested, cigar chomping like badass kind of dudes who can go out there and take out 20 people just by looking at them. They're ordinary kind of Irish people. They're ordinary citizens who join this multinational force, who believe they'll have an opportunity to kind of serve, to do the right thing, to get money for their families, and they just wing it, and things go horribly wrong, and they stick together and just try and figure it out, and they fuck up a lot of the times, but that's part of the fun of it. So I took those experiences and put it in there to make it as realistic as possible.
So, did you ever deploy with the Irish Defense Forces under some of their peacekeeping? So, I know they were in Chad and Liberia and Syria. Did you do any of those NATO missions?
No, we're forbidden to do that. Even to this day, the reserves are forbidden from being sent on deployment, which is something that we've been screaming about for decades now. At this point, even when I was enlisted, when I was a 3-star soldier at the time, so that's mid 2000s. We were they did a poll, like a survey amongst the entire organization, which was about 4,500 people at the time, which I know is terrible. It should have been effective strength should have been closer to 13,000, which what it was in the 70s. But they basically did a poll and asked a series of questions. If you were offered deployment right now, would you go for it? Was one of them, essentially, and it was a resounding something like 95 or 96% said yes. Every single one of us would have put our lives on hold to go and do it, for the experience, to contribute, to give back, and it was just shelved. We never heard from it again. It was only last year that the first reservist in Irish history was ever deployed to I think it was out in the Lebanon, and it was a reservist communications expert just to support with getting their communications up. And even then, I think it was like a 2-week mission. So it's a big bone of contention that we weren't kind of given the opportunity to do things like that. Like we were a volunteer force as well, so we weren't paid for a lot of the stuff that we did. We got paid for courses or for going off for a couple of weeks, but for showing up in barracks, that's all free. So it's the fact that we weren't kind of paid, we weren't given the opportunities, and as an organization, it's been slowly allowed to die, essentially. I think even as recent as now, if you looked at the organization as a whole, the Reserve Defence Forces, there's probably an effective strength of probably like 1,500 people, realistically, which is an absolute shame considering the sheer thousands of people who put on the uniform and who offer to serve and then just being allowed, disappear. Who could contribute free time to support the defense of the nation, and they're just effectively being spat on from the higher ups.
Well, that's disappointing. I did not see.
Yeah.
We're learning not just about you, but about your country's military.
Yeah,
So,
it is.
as a creator, do you ever draw on people you knew when you were in uniform?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think like I wouldn't say I'd kind of replicate one character as a replication of an actual real person, but it would take certain personality types or some stories that people have told me or I've overheard or I've lived through myself, and I think that adds to the kind of realism of a story like that. And something like a lot of my kind of readers and followers are veterans themselves, and I think because they relate to some of the things that I talk about. But one of the things that has been repeatedly said to me from fans of the series, in the second book, there's it's set in the 50s, so it's set 20 years before Big Red. There's a bit of time travel going on. I won't spoil it or anything, but it's basically this multinational force of British and French soldiers are sent to Mars to get rid of the last remnants of the Third Reich. So the Nazis, some of the Nazis escaped just before the end of World War II, set up bases on Mars, and this multinational force called the Mars Expeditionary Force gets sent to Mars to clear them out. out. They wake up from their cryo sleep, and this character, one of my favorites, a fella called Jenkins, comes across as very simple-minded. Comes across as, he's like the laughing stock of the platoon, the butt of everyone's jokes. And as they're waking up, the sergeant is kind of getting them to put on their EVA suits, which are these big, bulky, kind of 50s style NASA EVA type of things. And Jenkins is the only one to point out that they're all white. So they're going to land on the red planet, with a red and kind of copper, kind of brown kind of surface in pure white suits, which is going to make them stand out against all the terrain. And it's that one guy, the guy who everyone's joking and shoving and kind of, giving him shit over, is the only one to twig. Well, we trained with these camo ones back in, the base back home, but we're all wearing white. Is that not going to make us stand out, So little things like that, like sending soldiers to Mars without the right equipment and with kind of, outdated kind of weaponry and insufficient ammunition and insufficient preparation. That's just one of those things, that I drew on my experiences because I'd lived through them. I've been there. Like I fired a Bren light machine gun. That was our FSG, our fire support group. And the Bren was a weapon the British Army used in World War II. So I took all these little pieces and put them into a story, and I think it works from the feedback I'm getting. It seems to work anyway,
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're going to pause for a moment because we could keep going on these stories, but I realize we're 50 minutes in and we haven't talked about your book that brought us here. Okay, so cool. I'm going to pause for a moment. We're going to air the commercial, and then when we get back, we're going to dive into the book that brought us here because I'm interested in how, given what we learned about you writing basically the everyman, which is what I like to read and write myself. So I get it. I want to see how that plays out on your fantasy side. So we're going to play that beautiful commercial, and then we're going to jump right back into to talking about your books.
Bring it on.
In Cheers. A galaxy tied together by the magic of the elite jump mages, new graduate Damien Montgomery is in search of his first assignment. Without elite blood ties and high-powered connections, he can't find a ship to sign on to. A pirate attack left David White with a damaged freighter and a dead jump mage. The dead mage's grieving father blacklists him and makes it impossible to hire a replacement. Without a mage to jump his ship, he's stranded. When their desperate needs meet, Damien is drawn into a conflict with the most powerful criminal organization in the galaxy and draws the attention of the Mage King of Mars himself. Starship's Mage, the first book in a science fantasy series by Glenn Stewart, is available on Kindle and Audible.
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. We appreciate your patronage and your patience. So now we're going to dive into the story that brought us here. So we talked a lot about yours and mine too, love of sci-fi, of the mill sci-fi that we read. But this series, and I'm going to throw the cover up while we talk, this series is clearly fantasy. And you mentioned that it's sword and shield and dinosaurs, very cool things. So what is the, and we'll come back to the cover in a minute, but what is the premise of this series?
So it's basically, the way I kind of pitched it was Game of Thrones meets Jurassic Park. It's set in a fantasy kind of alternative world. There's this place called the Kingdom of Hypernia, which is this all-encompassing, it's like the dominant world power at the time, but it's in a constant state of war. So it's continually at war with its various different neighbors. It basically conscripts young men and women to fight for 2 or 3 years for a limited kind of money, which has led to the creation of these kind of mercenary companies who'll offer higher pay for kind of, really trained kind of people. The story itself follows a mercenary legion called the Dead Mothers, who are basically experts at all types of warfare. So they divide themselves into different cohorts. So you might have one cohort experience in jungle warfare, one in kind of naval combat, one in kind of mountainous terrain and so forth. They receive a contract from the King of Hypernia to investigate this landmass. It's recently discovered landmass. It was founded 60 years before the story, but it's inhabited by what they call great lizards, which are essentially essentially what we call dinosaurs. The whole point of dispatching them is to retrieve what they call king jaws, which are what they call T-Rex eggs. Because this king, he's essentially a mad king, wants to utilize these king jaws or T-Rexes in his constant wars. So basically, he wants to try and develop new weapons to stave off his enemies and fulfill his conquest. The story itself is kind of split into 3 points of view. We've got a Captain Dustin. He's a recently promoted mercenary captain. He's in charge of the third cohort. It's his role to basically infiltrate this hideous kind of jungle, march into it, stay alive long enough to get close to a T-Rex nest and steal these eggs. He's backed by his right hand person is a cohort sergeant Lundu. She's this fierce enlisted woman. She's highly dedicated to the men and women serving under her. She's there to offer advice. She's vicious. She can any weapon placed in her hands, she's absolutely devastating with. And the third character is a woman called Boy, who is a person who grew up on this landmass, and she's an expert tracker. She knows how to survive in the wilderness, basically. And these kind of 3 points of views all meld into this one story where they march into this jungle. It's a straightforward mission. They know the likelihood that a lot of them will die. It's going to happen, but there's more than dinosaurs waiting for them in there. There's a lot of twists. There's a lot of kind of unexpected kind of situations where we get to see ordinary soldiers who are there, basically for the money, but who fight for each other. They fight to keep each other alive against insurmountable odds, against absolute creatures that are devastating, terrifying, utterly hideous to the core. And they do everything they can to fulfill their mission and get out, essentially, and try and keep as many of them alive as possible. So a lot of kind of dinosaur battles, a lot of twists, a lot of action, a lot of surprises, a lot of horror in there.
So how much of this is like legitimate dinosaurs just reskinned, and how much of this is creative imaginings? Like, would a paleontologist that studies dinosaurs read this and be like, okay, you got that right? Or is it rule of cool?
I think I kind of I borrowed the Jurassic Park rule there. So any dinosaur in the written about is in a Jurassic Park movie, is the way I kind of put it. And the way I kind of I didn't want to get lost down the rabbit hole of researching different kind of dinosaurs across different eras and finding out all this. I said, look, this is my kind of I'm tipping my hat a little bit at the Jurassic Park series, which I love that as a franchise. I love reading the books. I'm just going to base it on the dinosaurs that you see in those movies. Now, not every single dinosaur in those movies will be in there, but anything you read about, you'll recognize from the first 3 movies, essentially.
Okay, that's deal. So I'm going to throw the cover back on. So what can you tell us about the cover? Because this is glorious. It made me want to do the interview. Obviously, you've got the guy and a girl in this case. You got a little bit of the fire going on, and you can see the torches to light everything. And then, of course, this giant, what looks like a T-Rex with fur almost.
It's it's supposed to be like a T-Rex, and that's supposed to be the kind of the scales on it. Just with the light, there's a fire in front of them. It's based on one of the scenes in the book where they basically come face to face with it for the first time, and it's absolute terror is happening all around them. Discipline collapses. They've already lost a portion of their cohort at this point, and it's one of those moments where they're kind of rooted by absolute fear, where they're coming face to face with their worst nightmares. Some, make the decision to try and stand their ground. Others just run. The smart ones just run out of there. So that's supposed to be on the right is Captain Dustin, the leader of the third cohort, and on the left is Boy, the woman tracker, who's a native of this place, and she's pretty much telling them, look, we need to get the fuck out of here. We're going to get eaten. And he's kind of a bit more like, no, hang on, we stand our ground. We're dead mothers and all this, So that's the scene essentially.
Nice. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, where did you get the premise for the story? Like, obviously, people tend to think dinosaurs is in Portal fiction when you see a lot of it.
Yeah.
So you got people going in with modern weapons and like AT-4s and law rockets and whatever, shoulder-mounted anti-tank weapon you guys have in Ireland. We use the AT-4, or at least we did when I was in, which replaced the law rocket or the bazooka, I guess, from World War II. So people kind of like the idea of that, right? Of course, you're going to take a T-Rex out if you've got a shoulder-fired rocket. You send them in there with bows and arrows and shields and swords, which makes it a lot more gruesome, right? So where did you get the idea to tell the story this way?
So I think it's like as we've talked about, I'm a fan of the series and or the Jurassic Park series, and like I distinctly remember one day when I was rewatching it. Like I probably rewatch it once a year, give or take, and it would have been around the time when I was watching the last series of Game of Thrones. But I remember kind of watching Jurassic Park 1, thinking, I love this film. It's absolutely fantastic. But part of the reason why they've lasted this long is technology. Like even that scene where Dr. Alan Grant, they get the power back on, and the Velociraptor is kind of, he's at the door, and they get the doors bolted and all that. And he's got his shotgun at the ready, and he's kind of telling them that like he's going to bring the grandkids back and so forth. And then all of a sudden, like he fires off a couple of rounds, Velociraptor jumps through and stuff. And I'm thinking like if he didn't have that, he'd be screwed essentially. It didn't have the cars to drive from point A to point B, they'd be screwed. If they couldn't bring the computer system back online or the electricity and stuff, they wouldn't stand a chance. So then straight away, I was like, wow, imagine if they didn't have technology, which kind of led me to believe, like, kind of picture a story where it's modern day people, but without kind of any type of technology or guns or weaponry. And I was like, no, hang on, let's take this a step further. Let's regress this. Like, how would like soldiers, like you fight with swords and shields and armor, the medieval style kind of warriors, how would they handle a situation like this? And it was just like that. It was like one of those light bulb moments where it's like I envisioned it really, really clearly, where I just saw this one soldier with a sword in shield, kind of like the front cover, just standing there, ready to do combat in the only way that he knows how, against a monster, against a velociraptor, which are also in the story. And I just tried to imagine how would that go down, and it just spiraled from there. It just went in all sorts of mad directions. It was one of those kind of stories where I think I wrote the first draft, put it away just to work on another project, came back to it after a couple of weeks, added to it, took away from it, twisted it. That kind of continued on for about 2 years until I got to a point where I was like, I love what I'm after doing. It's not what you'd expect. You see the dinosaur on the cover and you think, okay, these guys are just going to go in and someone's going to fight a Tyrannosaurus Rex. There's a lot more to it than that. They're up against what they call slashers, which is what we call velociraptors, who seem to have an understanding of tactics and strategy, who believe in like almost like a war of attrition type of thing. So it's these humans who are so experienced in killing other humans are suddenly faced with an alien threat that they just cannot comprehend. And one of the things that sticks out in my mind was a scene where one of the soldiers was basically lured away and murdered horribly. And Captain Dustin at the time kind of thinks, like as he's kind of thinking about this, if they were humans, we would do what we've always done. We'd go over, we'd find the nearest village, we'd burn it to the ground, and put everyone to the sword. But how can you like punish a creature? How can you punish a lizard? It doesn't have a village. It doesn't have gold to steal. It doesn't have food to slaughter. We don't know a thing about it. How do we feed it basically? And it's that like man versus nature kind of scenario that just took on a life of its own.
I can appreciate that. So obviously we are looking at book 1 on the cover. Is this going to be a long running series? Is it just going to be a trilogy? Like, what do you envision for this story?
I think just originally I was thinking of just doing one trilogy where it was going to be the story that I'm telling. So we've got Lizard Skin here. You'll have the second book and then the third book, and I was going to leave it there. But recently, I kind of again, my mind just keeps going and keeps turning with ideas. And sometimes I'll have an idea and I'll kind of think, oh, I kind of like that. I'll come back to it later. But a part of me was kind of thinking, like, what if I did a story set in this universe, but 1,000, and 500 years into the future, where dinosaurs have become integrated into human society, So it's like, and technology has changed in a different direction, where there's no such thing as combustion engines because you've like pterodactyls to kind of fly on between continents. You didn't develop coal because there's a big, giant, huge, undersea dinosaur thing that trained to kind of pull big like boats from continent to continent and stuff. So I'm still kind of teasing that one out, but I had enough of an initial idea that I was like, wow, I'm going to explore that once I get the tree done. I think there's something there. We'll see.
So long story short is, if the readers really like it, they should buy all 3 so you're motivated to keep going.
Oh, absolutely. It's all based on sales. The more sales I get, the more I'll write, hands down. So yeah, keep them coming. If you like this one, read the second one. I'll write the third. I'll write a prequel. I'll write kind of spin-offs. I'll write futuristic ones, whatever it takes. Whatever people like. As long as I love the story and enjoy the world I'm in, I'll keep writing.
Okay, so obviously there are well, I don't say prehistoric. There are people that live there in the more primitive land, and then you've got people that coming from a more modern land and go there.
Yes.
What do you use to transport them there?
So in this story, it's boats. So it's a medieval style kind of world where they have kind of like metalwork, and they have kind of boats. So it actually takes a month for them to travel from the kingdom of Hibernia to this, what they call the landmass, the unexplored kind of area. And it was only founded by sailors who got shipwrecked and happened to explore it, kind of thing, and kind of realized there's more creatures there, which then set off a bit of a race, as kind of, the kingdom of Hibernia is, because it's overpopulated and starved for land. You've got like an overabundance of kind of people who are looking for places to settle, and they moved over to this new place, but could only settle on the coastline and on this island just off the coast they call Eggshell Island. So there is kind of like narrow strips of colonists there, but you can't penetrate the interior. And that's part of the fun of the story, is these mercenaries are going to do what nobody's been able to do for 60 years, which is actually march into the interior in force and try and steal these eggs and then march out alive. And the story kind of deals with the calamity of all their actions there on that one.
So this is basically like if Columbus landed in the New World and they had dinosaurs, basically, is a kind of
Yes.
vibe.
Yeah, the nail on the head right there. Yeah.
You almost need to add, when you do the maps of this world for the book, like for the hardcover or whatever,
Yeah.
you got to add the here be dragons, only be here be dinosaurs or something.
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah.
That would be totally awesome.
You know, in the ancient maps they have that like, for faded off kind of sea areas, they'll have the kind of sea dragon or whatever. I was just going to have that, like, where it's like a really noticeable dinosaur kind of, creature that we'd recognize from our own history, but just as an artistic kind of version of it, So because they've hinted about kind of these different creatures and stuff like that, but they're all essentially dinosaurs that just survived.
So do you have like the aviary dinosaurs, so like the pterodactyl or any of those in here?
Yeah, they're called beakers in this story because they're the prolonged beak.
Yeah. What about some of the larger, like the bugs would have been larger? I mean, like with the
there's references to bugs and stuff where where they use it for nutrients when they've run out of food. The tracker boy kind of shows them how to find these certain bugs. Now, I haven't kind of dealt too much into the insect side of things, mainly because it's a fairly kind of linear journey, in the sense that they're going from point A. It's a 3-day march in. They infiltrate in and then they have to get back. But it's the calamity of what happens on that journey, both there and back, is what I'm exploring. So part 2 is going to take a bit of a wider look at the overall landmass. I suppose with this one, I didn't want to get bogged down in the details of too many other creatures, because I wanted to kind of keep the focus on, these are normal humans that are absolutely terrified of their surroundings, and they've no idea what's going on. Basic understanding of what these great lizards are and what they can do, but it's only when they get there that they realize the sheer terror of what they're up against. Whereas, once we've explored all that in book 1, in book 2, survivors will essentially kind of have a better understanding of the world and will need to explore it a bit more to kind of pull the story forward. So there would be kind of, room for exploring it a bit more in that kind of context in the later books.
There's one speculative belief, or not speculative. One theorizes that some of the dinosaurs would have been more active at night, which would have made some pretty terrific nighttime scenes if all you have to see the world around you is a firelight from a torch.
Yep.
So do you do any of those scenes where the sheer terror of something coming out of the dark?
Yes. I'm not going to spoil her, but yeah, there's one really good scene, and I got a bit of positive feedback from one of my colleagues who's a veteran, who was just like, that nail on the head. That was just, it's not what you expect. It's just one of those things where it's shocking and it's terrifying, but just wait for it. It's yeah.
So when we talk arms, swords and shields, and arms and armor, like that spans a really long period of time, right? When we were fighting with shields. So what, if you were trying to pin it down kind of quasi to a timeline, like what era of weapons are we talking about? Like plate armor and broadswords? Are we talking gladiuses and Roman legionary chainmail? Like what are we talking for equipment they're using?
Yeah, so it would be long swords and spears as the primary offensive weapon. They'd have shoulder shields then. So, the ones that they kind of, I don't know the technical name for them, but the kind of like rectangular style ones. And knives, it would be plate armor. They don't have chainmail in it. They have bows and arrows, primarily long bows. and kind of some kind of short bows, but mostly kind of long bows. They, in terms of like, they have a like probably I think maybe 12th, 13th century, if I were to kind of
Okay.
guess around that area, but they'd have a bit more knowledge of medicine. Like they'd have an understanding of hygiene to a certain degree when it comes to cleaning wounds and kind of pouring alcohol on it and stuff like that. They'd know how to use herbs to kind of look after maladies, that type of scenario. So roughly 12th, 13th century, I'd say.
We actually knew more about medicine than we give our ancestors credit for. Like everyone thinks like, oh, we really will just rub fecal matter in the wound because we don't know any better. Like, no, they weren't stupid. Like,
they had to know, they had to figure out or they were dead.
Everything that pharmaceuticals is doing, before it was a pill, it was an herb, it was tree bark, it was something that was the root compound that pharmaceutical just sort of made more stronger, made stronger, made more potent, whatever. So like, the idea that our ancestors were dumb when it comes to that. I mean, there's evidence of complex brain surgery among like ancient Aztecs, right?
I've heard that.
I've seen where they did repair for skull injuries from some of the warfare back then. So they knew more about medicine than we give them credit for.
Absolutely. I think so a lot of science and stuff like that. There's been talk of like the Egyptians know more about astronomy than we do now, even with the telescopes and stuff, just based on where they kind of put some of their structures, So it's fascinating when you kind of read into it.
If you remember the 2012 where everyone was convinced that the world was going to end, because we've lived through a lot of the world should end right now. This was the Aztec calendar, or no, the Mayan calendar that was ending. I think it was 2012. But whenever it was, like, they were still, even all those hundreds of years later, they were accurate within seconds of celestial events they were like predicting.
Yeah, it's crazy. It is.
Can you imagine doing that math without a computer and a calculator? I mean, oh my goodness.
Yeah, it really is. It's mad. And the crazy thing is we'll probably never know, We'll never know kind of like the extent of what they knew. Like I've even heard about, what is it, the Baghdad battery, or I think it is.
Yeah.
Where it's like they think they've actually created a battery out of the materials and stuff and generate electricity. And it's like, if that's true, that's crazy. That's absolute like madness. Think what our ancestors have probably done and we may never know about.
Do you know what napalm is?
Yes, yeah.
So they actually think Greek fire was a primitive version of napalm that the Greeks discovered. So I mean, like the idea that they didn't know stuff.
Yeah, no, that's
they were engaging in germ warfare. Like they were intentionally taking bad thing from this animal, bad thing from that animal, combining it and like throwing it into towns that they were going to try to conquer. Like they might not have understood like the cellular level of what was going on, but I mean, cause and effect is pretty easy, right, to figure out. So,
it is.
So for the main characters in your story, are they walking? Are they doing this mounted on horses, mounted on something else?
Yeah, it's all walking. So and again, the logic was that if they took animals into the jungle, it would attract some of the predators in there. So they kind of use camouflage at the start of it, where they're supplied with what they call the king jaws, the T-Rex. They actually get sacks of its feces, its shit basically. It's collected and brought out to the coastline. They land there and then smear their armor in this T-Rex shit, basically. And the whole point of it is that'll mask them from some of the predators, like the slashers or the velociraptors, and some of the other kind of predators in there. But it'll only last about 2 days. So they put this on. They're due to meet up at a certain point to get resupplied, and of course, things don't go according to plan.
I can just imagine the soldier being like, "Man, I didn't get paid enough.
Yeah,
for this. I need a bonus for this."
There's a lot of grumbling. There's a lot of grumbling.
This was not in the contract.
Yeah, exactly. There's a bit like that, where these two people are like, just they're putting on all the crap and they're just being belligerent, to their officer and stuff. We're grumbling. They're like, sir, we just want to kind of point out this is a really bad idea, And he's like, are your contract papers up to date? And they're like, yeah. I was like, get to it then.
So this is one of the things that amazes me. So when I was in the army in Iraq, we did with coalition forces. So we dealt with forces from militaries from all over the world.
Yeah.
And when you talk to them, what always surprised me is, as much as we're different culturally from all these different countries, there are some universal truths of military service.
Yeah.
And that is one of them. And it's nice to see you put that in the book. Because some of that stuff, like, I don't care what uniform or what era you serve. Some of that is just like guard duty sucks no matter what. When they wake you up early or they wake you up and it's like, oops, it's the other guy. And you've already woke me up. Like that kind of stuff is pretty universal.
It really is. It really is.
It's nice. Like We had these flashlights that were like green, almost like L-shaped, and it's like there's a meme that's like ruining your sleep early for 50 years or whatever. Like that kind of stuff just happens, right? Like how many times were you supposed to have guard duty and they woke you up early, or they woke you up and it was supposed to be Bob's turn or whatever, right?
I know, like, let's get to it.
It's nice that you brought some of that into this sort of medieval setting.
Yeah, well, it's like that. It's universal, and that's from kind of chatting to other kind of military science fiction authors who were kind of veterans and kind of reading their books. And it just goes to show that barracks kind of humor. It just crosses all national borders. You know, you make certain references. It doesn't matter what country you served for or in or anything like that. They'll get the joke. You know, so that's what I try and put as many of them in there as possible, because I know it'll resonate with other veterans, regardless of what country you fought for. You know.
Yeah, and the equipment never being the right size for you.
Exactly. It's always the wrong stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Whatever you need just isn't there, or it's antiquated. It's not what you need, you know.
So this is a thing that I think is also pretty universal. The idea when civilians hear military grade, they're like, "Oh, this is gonna be awesome." And those of us that serve, no, that means it's the low grade scrap made by the lowest bidder, right? Like, so I'm picturing now, like they go to pull their bow and arrow back, and the wood just cracks. Like, damn it, they did it again.
Yeah, it's universal. It's all in there.
So, given that you have sort of this hodgepodge company, like what kind of characters did you send? Like, obviously, you've got someone who's doing ranged, probably people with shields and spears. Like, do you have like an organizational thought to it, or did you kind of go with the Greek model where people got to carry what they liked unless they were in the phalanx?
So yeah, I mean, there is an organization to it. Now, I didn't kind of get bogged down in too many of the details. Like, I didn't kind of structure it as much for the reader, but I kind of left enough in there that there is a clear kind of understanding of the cohort as a whole. So, cohort works out as 500 people in this story. There's also auxiliaries who are kind of like the bowmen, and you have medical and logistic corps. So you basically have a couple of people assigned to just look after medical kind of matters, for the wounded, to kind of carry kind of a few bits and pieces. But the vast majority of the cohort are referred to as foot soldiers because they're primarily infantry. They have to carry their own supplies. So I mean, when it comes to packing up food, if they want to eat, they have to basically pack that there with them. There's no kind of, because they're not taking mules or horses, as described early in the story, because it would attract predators. If they want to take something, they have to hump it themselves, and that's something that the leader of the Dead Mother, the Legion, her own name is Mother, she specifically says you can take anything you want with you, but you're carrying it yourself. Leave all personal effects at home, but you need to carry, if you want to take certain equipment on the march in there, it's on your own shoulders, essentially.
Okay. Did you have them like potentially resupplying off of the dinosaur meat, or do you have that some reason why that's not edible? Like, have you addressed that at all yet?
Yeah, I mean, that's a core part of the story, where Boy, the tracker, the young woman who's kind of lived on the island her entire life, she knows how to live off the land, essentially. So her opening chapter, it explores her hunting what they call spitters, which are, I can't think of the dinosaur name, but when again Jurassic Park 1, it's got the flap of skin and shoots the poison.
Oh yeah. They shoot the fat guy with the can of shaving cream that's got the
DNA exactly that bit. I can't think of their name offhand, but she's hunting the baby versions of them to harness the poison gland, which she'll then use to put on arrows and put in knife tips and stuff. But she can basically skin certain kind of animals and eat off their flesh, and she herself wears lizard skin, which is where the title comes from. Her and her mentor, it's a fella called Sir, and they basically knit together their own kind of uniforms, their own kind of clothing, because it's water resistant, it's weather resistant, it's thick kind of dinosaur leather, so they wear that the whole time. They know how to hunt and trap dinosaurs. They know how to they know what parts of the dinosaur are inedible, what they can actually cook up, and there's multiple times throughout the story where that knowledge alone will save the cohort, or the survivors of the cohort, from starvation, because they don't understand how to hunt the most vulnerable. of kind of creatures. And there's a certain kind of tiny one, which is named after the compies in Jurassic Park, what they call skitters, which only come out at a certain time, which it tends to be in kind of like early morning, late night. So kind of like, when it's not quite dark, it's not quite bright, but she knows how to set up traps to kind of catch them. And even though they're small, they do provide a little bit of nutrition. So yeah, there's certain times when her skill set will kind of keep people alive based on that. But the soldiers themselves don't have any understanding of this. So they when they first march into the jungle, they deride her because she just looks so different from them in the sense that she's wearing lizard skin. She looks very unusual. She's like she's she's a Hibernian by birth, but she's never lived there. She doesn't understand their culture. She can speak the same language as them, but she doesn't understand the ins and outs. And likewise, they see her as an outsider. They just see her as like some weird. They frequently refer to her as Lizard Girl, because she's just so odd to them. But she ends up being the difference between life and death because she knows how to survive.
Okay, so what can you tell us about? Is there an antagonist for the story, or is it more man versus nature?
There is, I'd say, if I were to describe, I'd say it probably is man versus nature, but there is, it's a tricky one to kind of answer because, there is, I suppose, an antagonist, but I can't really give too much away on it because that would spoil the kind of end of the story. So if you're reading it, I'd say read it as a man versus nature survival story, but I drop a couple of hints, fairly early in the story, and then it builds up to something epic as the story progresses. So there's a lot of kind of stuff, battle scenes that I think are very unique in the sense that I've never read anything like them before. And I think, if you're the type of person, if you read the first couple of chapters, you're like, okay, this is really interesting. If you continue reading, the idea you have in your head for how it ends up is going to be entirely different, and all the better for it. So I don't really want to kind of give too much away in that. I would say that there's more than what's going on that meets the eye, and right up until the last chapter, you'll just be like, wow, I didn't see that coming. There's a lot of plot twists, which is something I do in all my works. I never like telling a straight story, even in Big Red, where it's the unreliable narrator. But even in this story, I love misdirection. I love throwing twists in there. I love kind of, I'm making you look at this hand while this hand is punching me in the face type of scenario.
Okay, so some people that write fantasy have their only martial arts they know how to fight with is if they have their blade, their shield, their spear, whatever. But if you de-arm them, they're helpless. Other people try to give some form of martial arts that's hand-to-hand as well. We know just from manuals that in the medieval ages, they did have a form. They call it HEMA now, Historical European Martial Arts. And they had other, like African countries had their own martial arts that if they got de-armed, they could still fight.
Yep.
That doesn't happen a lot in fantasy, though. They either go straight into their kung fu ninja master, or if they don't have a sword, they can't fight. Do you address that at all with the hand-to-hand, or is it because the monsters are so big they're pretty much SOL?
Yeah, it's pretty much because the dinosaurs are so huge and humongous and so ferocious and so numerous and stuff like that. The most of it is kind of sword-based combat. I mean, there are times when there's kind of scuffles, in certain kind of scenes where they're temporarily weaponless and they will kind of like defend themselves, but it's more of a wrestling kind of hodgepodge type of thing versus any unique kind of martial art. And it's something I did kind of consider because I did taekwondo for 9 years myself, and I've had kind of like I've written kind of combat scenes that are like without weaponry where it's hand to hand type of stuff. But for this story, I didn't want to get bogged down too much in it now because it's based around the premise of that those armored soldiers who are going in there with their big weapons to take on these really big creatures. I didn't want to waste too much time going into exploring the unarmed combat side of stuff, since that doesn't happen too much within the story. It'd be different, say, if they were facing other knights, where they might be given the chance to kind of maybe fight them on equal footing. But if you imagine a situation where you're up against a velociraptor, you've got a longsword, you lose that longsword, you're in armor, which will kind of give you some level of defense, but you're not going to be able to execute a jump and flying kick. You could try and wrestle it, but it's going to bite your throat off straight away. So I kind of didn't want to bog myself down too much in it for this story. I did want to, in the second book, want to explore it a little bit more because I wanted to have like an armorless, like advanced recon unit who kind of infiltrate the jungles again, and they're more reliant on speed versus kind of heavy weaponry, which is something that's explored a little bit at the start of the story, where the scouts, so Boy, believes that speed and stealth is the best weapon. That in order to kind of survive this mission, they need to leave all their armor, need to just get in and get out as quick as humanly possible. But she's overruled, and they're basically told by the leader of the Legion Mother that they have to go in armored because that'll form the maximum protection between jaws gripping down your arm or whatever. So there's those two philosophies there. I just didn't want to kind of get bogged down in the unarmed thing and kind of take away from what I'm trying to kind of portray, but something I will definitely be exploring in later books.
Now I'm picturing like the next series is like Velociraptors at Dawn, where they were like mounted knights riding Velociraptors into combat.
No comment.
There's actually a short story about that, although it's not.
I've heard that. Yeah. I found it recently. I haven't actually read it now, but when I was doing a bit of research just to see if there's any kind of books out there, I came across that. I was like, it's interesting.
It's by Joe Vasicek is the one I'm talking about. And he basically it's sort of like an AI type deal, like, so it's not real space, and they do have Velociraptors as their mounts, and then they they basically like tilting at, what is it called, jousting, I guess, on Velociraptors, which I just think is amazing.
That's awesome. I'll have to give it a read. That sounds really cool.
But I'm just picturing that, like, taking, in a medieval, like, you've got dragon riders, why not dino riders, right? I mean, like,
that was the thinking behind when I was chatting to you earlier on about the futuristic kind of version of that, where it moves 1500 years into this world, and dinosaurs have become assimilated to human culture. And I kind of thought out this kind of almost like a World War I style story, where you have these two nations going to war, but rather than kind of riding mounts, they ride like longhorns, what they call, they use pterodactyls as an air force. They have like big giant, big huge sea dinosaurs as basically aircraft carriers, because they've never had to rely on technology to fly or combustion engines to move quickly from one place to another. Imagine, fusing this kind of almost like, I don't want to say World War One because they don't have guns in it, but like almost one World War One style technology to a certain degree, just with crossbows and dinosaurs as your Air Force and Navy. So watch this space.
Yeah, it's a lot of room to explore.
I need to think it out. I need to think it out. We'll see.
Yeah, this is just it's fun though. I really dig it. So do you explore the culture of the ones that are living on this, dinosaur continent as separate from Hyperion? Like, is it something that you dive into a lot, or is it more focused on the soldiers in the cohort coming over?
I'd explore it from Boy's perspective, mainly because, I mean, she is culturally and ethnically, she is from Hypernia, but she's never lived there a day in her life. Essentially, her backstory is that, like, she was 3 years old when she was orphaned on Eggshell Island, which is the primary hub for the landmass, where anyone who wants to go to the landmass starts there and then moves on to the landmass. So she was found by a disgruntled former veteran officer who goes by the name of Sir, and he looked after her. Call her Boy because she kind of points out he has absolutely no sense of humor, and he always wanted a son. So he kind of just looked after her from when she was 3 years old. He taught her how to hunt, taught her how to survive in the wilderness when hundreds of other people have been eaten alive within a day. So she's very proficient in survival, but she consistently feels like an outsider. So from time to time they go to resupply missions to Eggshell Island, where she'll interact with other citizens of Hibernia, and they mock her for the way she's different, in the sense that she dresses differently. She consumes lizard meat, whereas they kind of wouldn't as much. She wears their clothing. She just doesn't understand what home is, except from books. So in her head, she'll often dream of returning to the homeland and kind of seeing culture, and kind of seeing kind of the grand parks and the great palaces and the roads and stuff like that. And she kind of looks at these mercenaries who are mostly Hypernian themselves, and it's almost like an oddity to her. She's fascinated by them, annoyed by them as well, because they just seem so cocky and brash, and they think they know what they're doing, even though they're ridiculously stupid. They consistently ignore her solid advice to keep them alive, much to their own detriment. So I think from the exploration, most of it comes from her perspective, with some kind of political commentary coming from the likes of Alundu or Dustin's kind of point of view as they reminisce about the mercenary life and how they're just doing it to kind of pay off their family debts. Alundu only enlisted to get away from an abusive father and a drunken mother. Dustin was pulled from the poorhouse because his family were so poor. He was press ganged into the military and through sheer kind of meritocracy became an officer before he kind of left and then joined the Dead Mothers. So that'd be the main exploration for it. But again, because it's not really set in the kingdom of Hibernia, it's set in this foreign kind of landmass that's mostly unexplored. I wanted to leave it a little bit to the characters kind of contemplating it, but without a full-blown explanation of, right, this is Hibernian history, this is the political system, this is what they believe in. I kind of kept that to a minimum, to a certain degree.
So it's almost got shades of, if we look at real history, when the Europeans came over and they thought they were better than the natives, so they didn't always listen to them in the beginning about like how to survive on this land, and some of them died because of it. You get shades of that, like the clash of cultures almost.
Yeah, a little bit, except like it's their own colonists that are there. So when they're interacting with other people, it's their own citizens. So there's no kind of native people, on the landmass. It's just dinosaurs, So like the people who live there are kind of like I think of it more like the Wild West in America, where you've got these hardened frontier people who understand the land. They understand how to like make it grow. They understand how to survive together. They're very independent, isolationist. So they have those cultural and language kind of links to these people coming over to the landmass, but they view themselves as a different type of breed basically. So it's that kind of perspective of the outsider where they understand the concept of the motherland, they understand the concept of the home country, and they speak each other's language, but they're just two different branches of the same tree essentially.
So I know you didn't cover this in the book just because you started with them on this landmass, but
Yep.
Given that the pterodactyls fly, would that have been at least at a minimum something they would have been exposed to, because they presumably could have flown over to Hyperion? Or do you have a plot device that keeps everything contained?
So it's the fact that it's 4 week sail from Hypernia to the landmass, and I know we don't have a map for this now, but I have it kind of in my head where there's no kind of land. If to get to Hibernia, there's no land that a pterodactyl could settle on. So if you imagine pterodactyl, I kind of gave it like the likes of, I think I mentioned at some point in the story, where it has to feed at least once a day, kind of give or take. It has to kind of stop and it has to rest essentially. So there's
Right.
no way you could get that far out that it could travel over, and because they're so big, it's not like it could sneak onto a ship or anything like that, So that's what prevents any of that kind of migration essentially.
So
But they are used as a delicacy. They are kind of hunted and killed by the colonists who live there and then sent back to the homeland where their wings are eaten by the rich people.
Given if it's 3 weeks sail, a lot of food goes bad back by in that time. Do you have them some sort of preservation? Do they have sort of a way to keep things from decomposing, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, most of it was kind of, I had it like in my head. Again, I don't explore into it too much, but it's kind of salt preservation, preserving
Okay.
meats and kind of bread like that. But as well, they get a lot of their supplies from the colonists when they land there. So they've done like say a 4 week sail from the home country to get to Eggshell Island, which is the primary hub, and that's where they'll get everything they need for the trek inland, because the colonists who live there have colonized the coastline. So they've set up farms, they've set up lizard meat export businesses, they fish in the sea, they kind of, they've got kind of farms for pork and chicken and beef and stuff like that, but only on the coastline where they can defend against potential predators and where predators don't tend to kind of venture out to essentially. So there is a way for them to kind of move within the 4 week period, eating kind of shitty rations, but then get there and have access to fresh food, which they can purchase and then use for the kind of week-long trek into the interior.
So do you have them exposed to the underwater dinosaurs, given that those can obviously travel, or do they just stay away from the shore for other reasons?
It's hinted at a little bit. So like in my head, it was because the landmass is so big, there's only a certain aspect of it that's ever been explored, and even on the maps itself, there's no kind of like delineation past the northern kind of ridge. So people know about this strip of land here. They know about kind of jungles that are south of that. They know about this massive kind of inactive volcano, but no one's ever been to the furthest east coast or west coast. So no matter, like, any explorers have tried, don't come back, and that's kind of led to stories about undersea monsters that just destroy ships and stuff like that. So in my head, it's because any of the undersea dinosaurs haven't migrated north, essentially, because where we are, like, if we put it in the context of our planet, it's on the equator, so it's warm, which is kind of keeping them alive, whereas the kingdom of Hibernia is colder. It's more up towards the north. So creatures like that who are sticking to the warm water aren't going to migrate up north
Okay.
because their food source isn't there, and it's too cold for them to survive. Now, it's something that over time they could evolve to move north, but it's never actually happened because of those reasons, whereas they're close to a landmass, they're close to a food source. So why would you? They've no natural predators because they're the biggest beasts, there. So, like, why would you want to move on when you have everything you need right there? Type of scenario.
That makes sense. Are you at some point going to produce a map for this world for those that like that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I've got one sketched out. Like, I have like a map that I kind of drew myself just to kind of say, okay, here's what I'm doing, here's where they're going, and stuff like that. It's just a matter of getting it produced, and it's something that I was kind of thinking about incorporating in a later edition. One of the reasons why I didn't get it done for this one was mainly for the Spiffbo competition. Spiffbo X or Spiffbo 10 is kicked off on the 10th of May. I only found out about it in April, and it's a competition I've been, dying to get involved in for a couple of years, but I hadn't actually self-published anything. So when I had my cover designed in April, I had the entire book polished, good to go, and I said, right, I just need to get it out there before Spitball kicks off, and I'd much rather kind of take the risk of getting into it just to see what it's like as a competition, and then I can always go back and kind of get a map made at a later date. So it's something, if I had kind of pushed it off by a couple of months, I probably could have gotten one made, but I'm at the point in my writing career where if I'm not going to do it now, I'm just going to come up with reasons to procrastinate, or I'll get bogged down in another project. And I wanted to pull the trigger. I kind of consider myself a bit of a man of action like that, where I get an idea into my head and I just want to do it. That's it. And I wanted to get this book out there. So I'm kind of happy in terms of the cover, happy in terms of the format, and happy in terms of the story. It's all polished, it's all as sharp and as good to go. I've been working on it for 2 years. I just don't have the map kind of done, and it's something I will look at now in the future.
Okay. Is this going to come out in audio at some point?
Yeah, at some point. Yeah, it's something I'd like to do. I think right now I'm kind of have a bit of a writing plan where I've had these books that I've been kind of working on over the last couple of years. Well, I was mainly focused on my primary military science fiction series. I was still writing other books outside of that series that I wanted to kind of self-publish. So the plan is basically to get them out there first, and then go back and then have a look at the audio side of things. So, for example, I'm working on, not that I'm working on, I've actually got it done. I'm just waiting on the cover. It's a military science fiction book. It's called The Truceless War. And it's basically a futuristic sci-fi retelling of the First Punic War, so which was between Rome and Carthage. It's just basically that entire 23-year war, except it's in space. It's got lasers. It's got giant robot mechs, and it takes place across an entire solar system. So I think I'm aiming to get that out in August, I think, according to my plan. And then I have another book that I was looking to get out potentially in October.
Nice. So you have Project ADD, where you just jump from project to project.
It's like I've got all that energy kind of burnt up or burning up inside me. If I have these projects that are good to go, or polished and they're solid, and I was like, this is the year I'm doing it, because I'm constantly kind of sitting there thinking, while I'm working on my, the Big Red series, for example, I was like, I'm working on this book as well, and I'd love to do it, but no, I don't have time to do it this year. I'll push it back, and I'll push it back, and I'll push it back. And I was like, no, like 2024 is the year I get these books out there. I've loved them, I've polished them, I've sharpened them, they're good to go. I'm happy with them, getting positive feedback from beta and ARC readers. So I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna relaunch my self-publishing kind of buzz.
Nice. Was there anything we didn't ask about this this series in this universe that you think the reader needs to know?
I think you've been very kind of comprehensive. So, like, fair play to you. Like, they're absolutely fantastic questions. All I would say to the reader is, like, it's not what you expect. Read the first couple of chapters. You'll draw a picture in your own mind. I guarantee you won't be able to guess what it's building up to. There's a couple of hints along the way, but so far, any of my advanced readers, or any of my beta readers, or anyone who's reading it now hasn't been able to connect the dots. So all I would say is just go with it. I'm a big fan of misdirection. I'm a big fan of plot twists and throwing things that you just don't expect happening. And that's one of my calling cards, I like to think. So just go into it with an open mind, and don't forget to leave me a review after.
So, given all the horrible things you've done to these characters, if the main characters met you in a dark alley and they knew that you were the man that created their hell, you were their deity, if it were, how do you see that interaction playing out? Are you screwed?
Oh yeah, I'd be getting kicked to death, and that's something I kind of toyed with doing, like a short story at some point. I wanted to do like an anthology, which exploring different aspects of the different worlds I've created. And I imagine the situation where the main characters from all the books I've written that are published or unpublished knocked on the door of my house one day, just while I'm working and kind of sipping on my morning coffee, and they would absolutely batter me right there and then. They wouldn't even straight up kill me; they'd make it slow. It'd be like, for all the misery and horror I've put them through, it would be like pulling out like fucking fingernails. It'd be like, a 1,000 cuts, bleed me to death, be beat me with a bag of oranges. Anything you can think of to make it prolonged and horrific, I think.
All right. Last question before we wrap this up. What would
Cool.
the age range of this story be? So if parents are sitting at home and they're listening to this and they want to know if it's right for their kid, because obviously kids love dinosaurs, right? What would you say the age range for the story is?
I would say probably PG-13, in the sense that, there's no kind of sex in it. There's no kind of like adult situations, I suppose, which isn't something I, as a writer, I tend not to write about too much. There's violence, but I think for a PG-13, I think children that age can handle it. Now, if you wanted to be more conservative, you could say 16. But as a 13-year-old, I've read much worse than that. There's nothing scarring, in the sense that it's just pure violence. Like it's bloody and it's gory, but it's nothing to give you nightmares, that I would imagine. Now, I mean, like that, if your child is a bit sensitive, like maybe definitely steer them away from it. But I would say PG-13. But if you wanted to be conservative, maybe 15, 16.
Okay. This is the part of the interview, dear listener, dear viewer, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book, so do your part. And that is especially helpful when we're talking about not debut, because you've got a couple books out, but newer authors on the independent side. Those reviews are the difference between the algorithms recommending the books to other people to find what you like. And so you definitely help the process, because the more you review it and spread the word about what you love, the more sales, the more motivation that author has to keep the series you love going. So you're helping yourself by helping the authors. So do your part, people, and leave a review. And with that being said, Damien, how can listeners and viewers find you on the interwebs? And we will link to all of that in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, you can find me across Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Threads, and I've got a website. If you type Damien Larkin into Google, that normally kind of brings up pretty much everywhere. I think in Twitter, it's Damo_Dangerman. In Instagram, it's Damo_Danger_Larkin. In Facebook, it's Damien Larkin, science fiction and fantasy author. And in Threads, it's the exact same as Instagram, which is Damo_Danger_Larkin. So do feel free to kind of check out my pages. If anyone has any questions, like, I'm always open to answer. Like, drop me a question in the comment or anything like that. Like, I always love interacting with people, and especially for any newbie writers out there, or anyone starting off, or anything on the writing front. I'm always very open to chatting to writers, so please don't hesitate.
So what is the story of Damo as the nickname?
It's a Dublin thing. So in Dublin, if you're a male, you tend to get a nickname, and it ends with O or E-R, and it's normally the first or first two syllables of your name. So like, I'm Damo, but if you say, for example, if you're John, you'd be John O or Johnner. If you were Shane, you'd be Shane O. That type of thing. It's just a pure Dublin thing.
Okay, that works.
By the way, only my mother calls me Damien. just for the record.
and people that are buying your books, because that's what you have them listed as, so that's what we want people to like. I drive home whatever their full publication name is, because if you give the wrong name, like, people can't find you as easy. And obviously, we want people to find the books of the guests we interview. So I have to remind guests, some of them, they're like, no, my nickname is Care Bear. And I'm like, yeah, but is that what they're going to find on your book titles? If not, that's not what they need to call you today, because we want them to buy your books.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think we've ever had a Care Bear. It was just the most ridiculous thing I could think of.
That sounds it. Yeah.
All right, dear listener, you can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the bit shoots, the rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, our Twitter, our email, Blasters and Blades podcast at gmail.com for professional purposes only, people. We have our Facebook group and Facebook page. And most importantly, we have Madam Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and email. So send all your shenanigans her way. She's here for it. And finally, we have our website listed on the Linktree. It is, now that it's a Spotify link, it is a bunch of gobbledygook. So it's easier just to go to the Linktree and click the links there. And we will link the Linktree in the comments. But on the website, you can donate to the show to keep the lights on for as little as 99 cents a month. You can make a difference. Or you could support us more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it's for the podcast. And I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink until their liver surrenders to the caffeine monsters. And that will be the day after they die. So we'll just keep drinking. Or you can support the show more directly by using the link in the comment section that is for Coffee Brand Coffee, buying some of their lovely Java. Use the code PODCASTGRUNTS, and you get 10% off, and we get a kickback as partners with the Coffee Brand Coffee Company. And with that being said, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy absentee co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. All right, Damien, thanks for coming by, man. That was a lot of fun.
Cheers, thank you. Really appreciate it, and fantastic to chat to you. And fair play to Steve as well for introducing us. Steve Caldwell, absolutely brilliant guy. Really appreciate him. So yeah, thank you very much.
We'll have to have you come back at some point in the future where you can talk about your Mill Sci-Fi series.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you.
But we got to give him time to listen to our 2-hour interview first.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, and with that, we are out, people.